Owen Martinez stood at the edge of the clearing, his heart racing and his mind in turmoil. Before him, the tall trees of the African jungle seemed to close in with a suffocating embrace, hiding in the shadows the secret that had consumed him for years. The letter in his pocket was a constant reminder of the warning he insisted on ignoring. The forest whispered tales of wild creatures and unspeakable dangers, but what truly haunted him was not what was hidden among the trees. It was what lay hidden within himself, the fear of reuniting with Julian, the gorilla he had raised and released, and discovering that the creature he loved so much could now be his greatest threat. With heavy breaths, he took the first step into the darkness, where the past and present would collide in an inevitable way. He freed a gorilla in the jungle, and years later, discovers an unimaginable secret. Owen Martinez held the letter in his hands, the crumpled paper and the words etched in his mind like scars. The message was clear and direct. Don't come back. He may not be the same anymore. His former colleague's words echoed in his mind, laden with a concern Owen couldn't ignore. But there was something inside Owen that compelled him to move forward, something beyond reason. The guilt mixed with duty, a sense of responsibility that had accompanied him throughout his life. 5 years earlier, Owen had made the difficult decision to free Julian, the gorilla he had raised since infancy. A bond had formed between them, as if their souls were connected. When Julian was released into the jungle, Owen knew he was doing the right thing, but that didn't relieve the void that had grown inside him since then. The gorilla was part of his life, and letting him go felt like tearing a piece of himself away. Now, however, Julian's wild world called him back. The letter said that Julian had changed, that life in the jungle had transformed him in ways Owen might not be prepared to understand. But Owen was not a man who shied away from challenges. He had dedicated his life to wildlife preservation, facing countless dangers in unknown lands. He believed that the connection he had with Julian was still there, somewhere, waiting to be rediscovered. Sitting in the wooden cabin he called home, Owen recalled the days they spent together. The memories came like flashes, the small gorilla, fragile and defenseless, gripping his hand tightly. The first wobbly steps in the tall grass. The moments of joy when Julian finally adapted to life in the forest, each movement a celebration of the freedom he so deserved. But there was also the memory of the farewell, the deep look Julian gave him before disappearing among the trees, a look Owen could never forget. With a heavy sigh, Owen began to prepare his things. He knew this trip was madness, that he was challenging fate itself, but he also knew that if he didn't go, he would spend the rest of his life wondering what could have been. The guilt of not going would be an even greater burden. The next day, Owen set off for the jungle. The journey was long and exhausting, but he did not give up. Each kilometer brought him closer to Julian, but also to his own fears. The words of the letter continued to haunt him, but he pushed them to the back of his mind, focusing on the mission ahead. For Owen, the African jungle was familiar territory, but at the same time, everything felt different, more intense. The jungle seemed alive, pulsing with an energy Owen couldn't ignore. Each step was a step closer to Julian, and the weight of the warnings became harder to ignore. Owen began to question his decision. What if Julian really had changed? What if he was just another intruder in a world where he was no longer welcome? But turning back was not an option. He knew he needed to keep going, that he had to face whatever awaited him in the heart of the jungle. Owen was not a man who ran from danger, and he wouldn't start now. Owen advanced through the jungle, accompanied by 2 local guides, men of few words, but with sharp eyes that seemed to capture every detail around. The silence was broken only by the natural sounds of the forest, the songs of birds, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the occasional cries of distant animals. As he walked, insecurity began to take hold of Owen. Now he wondered if Julian wouldn't recognize him. Worse yet, what if Julian saw him as a threat? The jungle seemed to reflect his doubts, with every shadow and sound amplifying the uncertainty in his heart. The path was narrower now, forcing them to walk in a single file, their eyes alert for any sign of danger. The trees closed in around them, creating a green and oppressive maze. After hours of walking, One of the guides suddenly stopped and crouched down, studying the ground with an intensity that made Owen's heart race. He leaned in, trying to see what the man had noticed. It was a footprint, huge and clear in the damp earth. No doubt about it, it belonged to a gorilla. Owen felt a mix of relief and anxiety as he realized he was getting close. "What do you think?" Owen asked in a whisper, as if fearing that speaking out loud might somehow alert the jungle. The guide looked at him, his face impassive. "He's close. Very close." The guide's words sent a wave of adrenaline through Owen's body. Julian was nearby, perhaps already aware of their presence. He tried to imagine what the gorilla was thinking, whether there was still any trace of the affection they once shared, or if time and the jungle had completely transformed him. They continued walking, now at a more cautious pace. The signs of Julian's presence became more evident. Broken branches, marks on trees, even a faint scent in the air that Owen recognized from his earlier expeditions. What if Julian had become a wild creature, guided only by instincts, Owen thought. Suddenly, the silence of the jungle was shattered by a sound that made Owen's blood run cold. A deep, threatening roar echoed through the trees, reverberating in Owen's chest. He turned to the guides, who exchanged quick, tense glances. "It's him," said the guide, concern evident in his voice. Owen felt his body tense. Julian was nearby, but the sound he had just heard was not that of an animal happy to reunite with an old friend. It was the sound of a creature that saw intruders in its territory. Owen forced himself to continue. The crucial moment was approaching, where everything he hoped for and feared would meet. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the growing fear that the Julian he once knew no longer existed. They continued to move forward cautiously, their senses heightened. The jungle seemed to have changed from one moment to the next, as if it were preparing for something. Then, from among the trees, a quick movement caught Owen's attention. A shadow, large and agile, passed between the trunks. He stopped, his eyes wide. There was no doubt. It was Julian. The gorilla appeared, his massive body standing out against the surrounding green. He stopped a few meters away, looking directly at Owen with eyes that seemed to shine in the dim light. Owen held his breath. Julian looked different, bigger, stronger, more imposing than he remembered. This was no longer the baby he had raised. Julian did not move for a moment, just observing. Owen felt a mix of emotions ranging from fear to fragile hope. He took a step forward, his arms slightly raised in a gesture of peace. But the roar that Julian let out in response was fierce, causing the guides to retreat immediately. Owen stopped, his body tense, trying to decide what to do. Julian's roar was not just a warning, it was a clear display of strength, a reminder that he was in unfamiliar territory. But at the same time, there was something in Julian's eyes, something Owen couldn't define, a shadow of recognition that made him hesitate. "Julian," Owen called softly, trying to reach for that ancient connection, even knowing it might be in vain. "It's me." Julian moved a little closer, still wary. The gorilla sniffed the air around him, his eyes fixed on Owen. Time seemed to stand still. Owen felt an almost unbearable tension as he waited, unsure of what to expect. And then, slowly, Julian lowered his head, as if pondering the situation, as if trying to remember something long forgotten. Owen didn't dare to move, his heart pounding in his chest. This small gesture from Julian was not what he had expected, but it was also not a total rejection. It was an opening, a small indication that maybe, just maybe, the bond they shared was still there, buried beneath years of wild living. "I won't hurt you," Owen murmured, more to himself than to Julian. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he also knew he had to try. Julian stood before him, more real and terrifying than he had ever imagined, and yet Owen felt a wave of determination rise within him. He hadn't come this far to give up. Julian remained still, watching Owen with a look that mixed curiosity and distrust. Owen knew that any wrong move could be the end, but he also knew he had to trust in that connection, in what they had before. Slowly he crouched down, picked up a handful of leaves from the ground, and extended them toward Julian, a gesture that used to calm the gorilla when he was young. The seconds that followed felt eternal. Owen felt the weight of the decision being made in that moment. and a part of him braced for the worst. But to his surprise, Julian moved forward slowly, his eyes still fixed on Owen's, and carefully took the leaves. Owen could hardly believe what he was seeing. The gesture, though simple, brought immense relief. Julian recognized him somehow and did not attack. Owen breathed deeply, feeling a wave of emotions he could barely control. Julian was still there, somewhere inside that massive body. The jungle might have changed Julian, but it had not completely destroyed him. Owen felt a slight tremor in his hands as he watched the gorilla eat the leaves, as if time had turned back for a moment, bringing back the young gorilla he had raised. But before Owen could fully relax, Julian suddenly lifted his head, his eyes fixed on something behind him. Owen turned around. The guides had already backed away, and the sound of breaking branches indicated that something was approaching. The moment of calm dissipated as quickly as it had come, and Owen knew that the true test was still to come. The tension returned with full force. Julian was on high alert, his eyes locked on the dense vegetation behind Owen. The tranquility of the previous moment evaporated, replaced by a sense of imminent danger. Owen turned slowly, his heart pounding as he tried to discern what had caused Julian's reaction. The sounds of the jungle, once distant, now seemed to be closing in. The rustling of leaves and the cracking of branches indicated that something large was moving through the trees. Owen looked at the guides, who were even tenser, their gazes scanning the surroundings. They knew that any wrong move could be fatal. Julian emitted a low grunt, a sound that made Owen realize they were not alone. The gorilla was no longer focused on him, but on something moving in the forest. Owen tried to see through the trees, but the vegetation was thick, creating shadows that danced and distorted any shape that tried to move through there. "Stay here," one of the guides whispered, beginning to move toward the noise, but Owen grabbed him by the arm. "No, stay close, we don't know what it is." Julian took a few steps forward, still grunting, his posture alert and defensive. Owen saw the tension in the gorilla's muscles, and suddenly the reality of the situation hit hard. Julian was ready to fight, and whatever was out there could be dangerous for all of them. Owen knew that Julian now was a force of nature, a creature that the jungle had shaped into something stronger and fiercer. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the trees, a roar that reverberated through the ground. Owen immediately recognized the sound of elephants, and before he could process what that meant, he saw the guides retreating quickly, pulling him along. A herd of elephants broke through the line of trees, their massive bodies knocking down branches and trampling the vegetation. They were running, panicked, as if something was scaring them or forcing them to move. Owen was pushed back, trying to avoid being trampled by the giants. Julian, on the other hand, stood still, his eyes alert and muscles tense. The elephants did not frighten him, but there was something else there. One of the elephants, disoriented, almost collided with Julian, but the gorilla jumped quickly to the side, letting the animal pass. Owen saw Julian's expression change, something between anger and a protective instinct. "What's happening?" Owen asked, but no one had answers. Chaos had suddenly taken hold, and all Owen knew was that he needed to stay safe and keep the guides close. The elephants continued to pass, as if fleeing from an invisible predator, their cries echoing in the jungle as their huge feet crushed everything in their path. Finally, when the last elephant passed, silence returned, but the air was still charged with tension. Owen looked around, trying to understand what the elephants might be fleeing from. Julian was standing, more alert than ever, sniffing the air as if searching for something only he could sense. "We need to move on," one of the guides said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here." Owen nodded, but his eyes did not leave Julian. Something was wrong. The elephant's behavior was a clear sign that there were more dangers hidden in the forest. He needed to regain Julian's trust, but he also needed to survive the jungle and everything it concealed. Owen couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. As they began to walk, Owen noticed that Julian was following him with caution, each movement loaded with brute and silent strength, his eyes scanning the forest as if waiting for danger to emerge at any moment. Owen saw that the bond between them, although weakened by time and distance, was beginning to reconstitute itself, not through the memory of the past, but through the necessity of survival in the present. The situation was becoming critical. the jungle pressing around them, the trees seeming to close in, and the air becoming denser, heavier. The guides were tense. Whatever was causing the elephant's behavior was nearby, and it could be something much worse than they imagined. Julian suddenly stopped, his body tense like a string about to snap. Owen froze, his heart pounding, as the gorilla lifted his snout to the air, sniffing more intensely. There was something there, something Owen couldn't see, but Julian surely sensed. He followed the gorilla's gaze, trying to catch what was hidden in the shadows. "Don't move," Owen ordered the guides, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know what was about to happen, but his instinct told him that any movement could trigger something dangerous. Suddenly, a large dark shadow emerged from the trees, so fast that Owen barely had time to react. The sound that accompanied the creature was something Owen would never forget, a primitive roar that seemed to come from the very heart of the jungle. Julian responded immediately, letting out a powerful roar in reply, and in an instant the creature retreated into the darkness of the forest. Owen tried to understand what had just happened, his heart racing uncontrollably, but all that remained was the sound of the jungle returning to normal, as if nothing had occurred. Julian was tense but did not advance. Owen knew they had just escaped something terrible, but the threat was still real. Julian walked alongside Owen again, closer this time, as if he wanted to protect him from any further danger. The jungle, which had once seemed merely a natural barrier, now revealed itself as an invisible battlefield, where predators and prey hid in the shadows, and where each step could be the last. Owen felt a new kind of fear growing inside him, but also a renewed determination. Julian was there with him, and the connection he thought had been lost was beginning to resurface, not as before, but in a new, wilder, and more real way. The jungle was testing their limits, putting them in increasingly intense situations, as if it were determined to reveal its darkest secrets. Julian's presence by his side, while comforting, was also a constant reminder that he was in unfamiliar territory, where the rules he knew no longer applied. Julian moved with fierce grace, his movements measured, his senses sharpened, as if he were ready for anything. Owen tried to keep up with him, but knew he was increasingly out of his comfort zone. The bond that once united them seemed fragile, sustained by memories and the mutual need for survival. As they advanced through the dense vegetation, Owen began to notice a change in Julian's behavior. The gorilla was restless, his eyes moving from side to side, and occasionally he would stop, staring intently in one direction before continuing. Owen realized that Julian was leading him somewhere, and the thought filled him with a mix of anticipation and fear. They arrived at a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees. Owen hesitated at the entrance to the clearing, feeling the air seemed different there, heavier, as if the very environment were aware of their presence. Julian moved ahead, leaving Owen a bit behind, and it was then that he saw it. In the center of the clearing were other gorillas, a small group of 5, all alert to Julian's arrival. There was something majestic and intimidating about that meeting. Julian approached them with a kind of natural authority, his movements slow and calculated, while the other gorillas recoiled slightly, respecting his presence. Owen watched with a mix of fascination and sadness. Julian was no longer the gorilla he had raised and freed. He was now the leader of his own group, a being shaped by the jungle, guided by instincts Owen did not share. That struck him hard. The Julian he had known, the one with whom he had shared so many experiences, was now part of something greater, something Owen could never fully understand. He took a few hesitant steps forward, and Julian, as if sensing Owen's presence, turned to face him. Julian's eyes held a depth Owen had never seen before, something that blended recognition with an inevitable distance. The bond between them was there, but it had changed, transformed into something Owen could not define. "Are you okay?" Owen murmured, more to himself than to Julian. He wanted to believe that his old friend was happy, that he had found his place in the wild world, even if it meant that Owen was now an intruder in that world. Julian, as if understanding, took a step back, indicating to Owen that he should keep his distance. The gesture was clear. Julian was with his family now, and Owen was no longer part of it. Owen's heart tightened as he realized the truth, but he knew he couldn't force a reunion that no longer belonged to him. He watched as Julian approached one of the smaller gorillas, probably one of his offspring. The scene unfolding before Owen was both beautiful and painful. Julian, the leader, the protector, was fulfilling his role in the jungle, a role that Owen knew he could never fully understand. Owen felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he didn't try to hold them back. He knew what he was seeing was a clear sign that Julian was no longer the gorilla he had raised. The jungle had transformed him into something greater, something Owen could not and should not try to change. He felt a wave of deep sadness, but also of acceptance. Julian belonged to that place, and Owen realized that, as painful as it was, he had to let him go. "I just wanted to see you," Owen whispered, feeling the weight of his words. "See if you were okay." Julian looked at him one more time, but this time there was something different in his eyes. A silent recognition, a mutual understanding that didn't need words. Owen knew at that moment that, even if they never saw each other again, the bond between them still existed, even if in a different form. Owen took a step back, and Julian, as if accepting his decision, turned back to his group. The silence of the jungle around them seemed more present than ever, as if it were watching the scene with invisible eyes. Owen knew it was time to leave, to let Julian have his new life, a life that he, Owen, could never be a part of. He turned around, starting to walk back along the path he had come, each step heavier than the last. He didn't look back. He didn't want to break what had just been established between them. Owen felt an overwhelming sadness, but also a sense of peace. He had seen Julian, and that was enough. No matter how much it hurt, he knew he had done the right thing. Owen knew that the journey was not over, but he now carried with him a painful certainty. The wild world was Julian's place, not his. The bond they had shared was there, but in a form that only the jungle now understood. He took a deep breath, letting the humid air fill his lungs, and moved forward, knowing that no matter how much it hurt, he needed to let him go. The rain started suddenly, as if the sky had decided to unleash all its fury in an instant. Thick, heavy drops fell hard, turning the jungle into a whirlwind of water and mud. The guides, experienced with the jungle's tempests, tried to maintain a steady pace, but the terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous. The darkness, intensified by the dense clouds and incessant rain, enveloped the group like a cloak, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. Owen felt worry grow. It was hard to keep focused, and the water soaked his clothes, turning the cold into an additional enemy. They were in a part of the jungle they didn't know well, and the storm made any attempt at navigation impossible. Suddenly, a gust of wind stronger than the previous ones caused a branch to break and fall near Owen, who instinctively jumped back. It was then that he realized he had separated from the guides. He looked around, but could see nothing but trees and curtains of water. "Where are you?" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm. Panic began to set in. He was alone in the middle of an unknown jungle, amidst a storm that seemed to want to swallow everything around him. The fear was palpable, but Owen knew he needed to stay calm. He took a deep breath, trying to hear any sound that wasn't the rain. Nothing. Just the deafening noise of nature in fury. With no choice, he started walking, trying to find some form of shelter. Each step was a monumental effort against the mud and the force of the water pouring down endlessly. The storm was relentless, and Owen knew he needed to find a safe place before his strength abandoned him. Then, in the midst of darkness and chaos, he saw something that made him stop. An imposing shadow appeared before him, moving with a confidence that only a creature completely adapted to the jungle could possess. Owen held his breath when he recognized Julian. The gorilla was alone, separated from his group, but seemed to know exactly what he was doing. "Julian!" Owen shouted, his voice filled with relief and surprise. He knew Julian was under no obligation to help him, but the mere sight of him there in the middle of that storm brought a wave of hope. Julian paused and turned his head toward Owen. For a moment, they stood there staring at each other, the rain pouring down on them as if it were a test imposed by the jungle itself. Julian made a subtle gesture with his head, almost imperceptible, as if indicating something to Owen. The gorilla then began to walk, not waiting to see if Owen would follow him. It was as if he knew Owen was lost and needed help. Owen, with no other option, followed him. Julian walked with ease, even amid the storm, as if the jungle were an extension of his own body. Owen struggled to keep up with Julian. Each of the gorilla's steps was firm and determined, and Owen felt he was being guided to somewhere safe. Julian knew this environment in a way Owen never could, and now he was entrusting his life to him. After what seemed like an eternity, Julian stopped in front of a rocky formation that Owen could barely see in the darkness. The gorilla effortlessly pushed aside some stones, revealing a small cave hidden by dense vegetation. Without hesitation, Owen entered. The cave was small, but offered the necessary shelter against the storm. He sat down, exhausted, while Julian remained outside, as if standing guard. Owen looked at the gorilla, who had his back to him, watching the jungle in its fury. A profound sense of gratitude washed over Owen. Julian had become something more than just an animal he had raised. He was now an entity of the jungle, a protective force, almost mythical, that Owen could barely comprehend. "Thank you," Owen whispered, knowing that Julian probably wouldn't understand him, but feeling the need to say something. Julian remained still like a sentinel. Owen allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, exhaustion finally taking over. He was safe, at least for now, and that was all that mattered. When Owen finally fell asleep, it was with the certainty that no matter how much he had lost the Julian he once knew, the gorilla before him was an extraordinary being, shaped by the jungle and strengthened by the challenges he had faced. Owen was at peace, knowing that in one way or another, he had fulfilled his role in Julian's life. Now he only had to survive the night, and perhaps find his way back to civilization, carrying with him the memories and lessons of that journey. But the jungle still had more to teach, and Owen felt that by dawn, his life would never be the same. The storm calmed, leaving only the constant dripping of the soaked leaves onto the damp ground. Owen slowly awakened, muscles sore and his mind still shrouded in the fog of sleep. He sat down, remembering the cave where he had found shelter, and then saw Julian standing at the entrance, observing the clearing now illuminated by the first rays of sun that managed to break through the dense canopy of trees. The gorilla was motionless, an imposing and solemn figure, as if he were in perfect harmony with the jungle around him. Owen felt a strange sense of peace. He knew he was approaching the end of his journey, and soon he would have to say goodbye to Julian, perhaps forever. "Julian?" Owen called softly, stepping closer to the entrance of the cave. The gorilla turned his head to look at him, his eyes revealing a tranquility that Owen had never seen before. Owen realized that this was the moment. He knew he should let Julian go, allow him to continue his life in the jungle without human interference. Owen had fulfilled his role, and now it was time to move on. He extended his hand, a gesture he made instinctively, even knowing that Julian no longer needed this kind of contact. Julian looked at his hand, but did not touch it. Instead, he slowly turned and began to walk toward the forest. Owen followed him for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. They walked together in silence until Julian stopped next to a massive tree, its roots sprawling like claws across the ground. Owen understood. Julian was showing him the way back, the point where their journeys would diverge. The gorilla turned to face him one last time, and Owen saw something in his eyes that almost made him want to stay. It was as if Julian somehow knew what was to come, as if he were accepting the fate that Owen so feared. "I will never forget you," Owen said, feeling his throat tighten. "You will always be a part of me." Julian stood watching Owen for a few more seconds before turning and disappearing into the dense vegetation. His majestic figure was quickly swallowed by the jungle. Owen stood still, staring at the spot where Julian had vanished, feeling a mix of relief and profound sadness. He knew that this was the last time he would see Julian. The gorilla had found his place, and Owen knew he needed to accept that. The return to civilization was solitary and reflective. He was no longer accompanied by the guides, who had been found by other explorers after the storm and indicated the way back to him. Owen refused the help of one of the men to carry his backpack, feeling that this last stretch of the journey needed to be made by him alone, as a kind of farewell ritual, not just to Julian, but to a significant part of his life. Upon reaching the edge of the jungle, where civilization began to reassert itself, Owen was greeted by a group of biologists who were there to study the local fauna. They welcomed him with surprise, informing him that they had lost contact with him during the storm and that many feared he had not survived. Owen appreciated their concerns, but his heart and mind were far away. After a few hours of rest and recovery, he was taken back to the city, where his old life awaited him. However, he felt different. Something inside him had changed. The jungle, Julian, all of it, had left a deep mark, and he knew that despite being back, he would never be the same. A few weeks later, back in the United States, Owen returned to the Martinez Foundation, the organization he had founded to protect wildlife. He threw himself into work, trying to fill the emptiness he felt with activities that had always been his life's purpose. But there was something that bothered him, a persistent feeling that there was still a missing piece in the puzzle of his journey with Julian. It was then that he received a letter. The handwriting was formal, and the sender was one of the researchers he knew superficially involved in preservation projects in Africa. A letter invited him to return to Gabon to discuss something important about Julian. Intrigued, Owen read the letter carefully. The researcher explained that Julian was not just an ordinary gorilla. He was part of a secret genetic preservation project. Julian had been selected to be a natural leader, chosen for his unique genetic traits that could be the key to saving his species. The project, which Owen was unaware of, involved the reintroduction of genetically enhanced gorillas into their natural habitat, hoping to strengthen the population and ensure the species' survival in the long term. Owen was paralyzed as he read the words explaining Julian's true purpose. Everything made sense: the strength, the intelligence, the leadership. Julian was not just a gorilla. He was a pillar for the future of his species, a symbol of resistance and renewal. The invitation in the letter was clear. The researchers wanted Owen to see the results of the project. Julian was now the leader of his group, and his role had expanded beyond what Owen could have imagined. But there was more. Julian had had a son, and the researchers believed that this baby carried even more promising genetic traits. Owen felt an overwhelming emotion as he read this. Julian, the gorilla he had raised, had become a leader, and now his legacy continued through his offspring. The letter ended with an invitation for Owen to see the baby and witness Julian's impact in the jungle. Owen spent days reflecting on the invitation. On one hand, he wanted more than anything to return, to see with his own eyes what Julian had become, and to meet his son. On the other hand, he knew that perhaps it was better to leave everything as it was, allowing the jungle to follow its course without interference. Finally, he made his decision. He sat in his office, looked for the last time at the photo of Julian that he kept on his desk, and whispered, "You made it, Julian. I'm at peace with this." Owen did not return to the jungle. He knew his time there had come to an end, but he would carry forever the lessons and memories of that journey. Instead, he continued his conservation work, now with an even clearer purpose: to protect those who, like Julian, carried the future in their hands, or rather in their paws. In the years that followed, Owen retired, but he never set aside his mission. He knew that somewhere deep in the jungle, Julian continued his role as a leader, and that his legacy would live on through future generations. And that was enough for him. Owen spent his last days in peace, with the certainty that he had done everything he could to ensure that Julian and his species had a real chance of survival. And when his time finally came, Owen closed his eyes with a smile, knowing that the bond he had created with Julian was eternal, even if it now belonged to the heart of the jungle. Thus, the story of Owen and Julian ended, not with a goodbye, but with a new beginning where the jungle continued to thrive, carrying within its core the indomitable spirit of a gorilla who had become more than just an animal. He had become a symbol of hope and renewal. We hope you were moved by this surprising story. If you enjoyed it, please leave your like to support us. For more impactful stories like this, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any updates. And don't forget to share your experiences, suggestions, and feedback in the comments. We love hearing from you. Together, we can create a community passionate about exciting narratives. Until next time.